Have you ever wondered what Earth looked like when the dust finally settled? The Earth after the dinosaurs. The thunderous footsteps of Tyrannosaurus rex have fallen silent. The ground no longer trembles beneath massive sauropods. The skies are empty of pterosaurs. In a geological instant, the Age of Reptiles has ended, and something entirely new is about to begin. What I'm about to show you will completely change how you think about life on Earth. Because the story that unfolded after the dinosaurs disappeared is more incredible, more surprising, and more dramatic than anything Hollywood could dream up. We're talking about a world so alien, so different from today, that if you could travel back in time, you might not even recognize our own planet. In this video, I'm going to take you on a journey through the most fascinating chapter in Earth's history that nobody talks about. We'll explore how tiny creatures smaller than your thumb inherited an entire planet, how forests of giant mushrooms towered over empty landscapes, and how the ancestors of every mammal alive today emerged from underground bunkers to rebuild the world from scratch. But here's what makes this story absolutely mind-blowing. Everything I'm about to reveal was discovered by scientists who became detectives, piecing together clues from rocks, fossils, and chemical signatures that are millions of years old. They've reconstructed an entire world that existed long before humans, using evidence so subtle that most people walk right over it every single day. What I'm about to share with you comes from decades of research by the world's leading scientists who have uncovered secrets that were buried for 66 million years. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll never look at the animals around you the same way again. But before we start, if you find comfort in these gentle explorations of space and science, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing and giving this video a like. The visuals are here for you, but feel free to close your eyes, breathe deep, and let your imagination drift through the world after the dinosaurs. I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight and what time it is for you. Feel free to drop your location and time in the comments below. Let's start. So let's step back in time to the moment that changed everything. It's 66 million years ago, and Earth has just experienced the most catastrophic event in the history of complex life. An asteroid 6 miles wide has slammed into what is now Mexico with the force of billions of nuclear bombs. The impact has triggered global wildfires, massive earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions that darken the sky for months. When the dust settles, roughly 75% of all species on Earth are gone. The non-avian dinosaurs, those magnificent giants that ruled for over 160 million years, have been wiped out. Marine reptiles like mosasaurs and plesiosaurs have vanished from the oceans. Flying reptiles called pterosaurs no longer soar through the skies. It's the end of an era, but it's also the beginning of something extraordinary. This moment marks the boundary between two geological periods, the Cretaceous and the Paleogene. Scientists call it the KPG boundary, and it represents one of the most dramatic turning points in the history of life on Earth. But here's what's fascinating. The extinction wasn't the end of the story. It was just the intermission before the most incredible comeback in natural history. Imagine walking through this post-apocalyptic world in the immediate aftermath. The landscape is eerily quiet. No roaring predators, no thundering herds. The silence is broken only by the wind and the occasional call of one of the few bird species that manage to survive. The ground is covered in a thin layer of ash and debris from the impact. Plants are struggling to photosynthesize in the dim light that filters through the dust-filled atmosphere. But if you look closely, if you know where to search, you'll find signs of life. Small creatures are emerging from burrows, from underwater hiding places, from the cracks and crevices where they waited out the catastrophe. These survivors are about to inherit an empty world, and they're going to transform it in ways that no one could have predicted. The first thing you need to understand about post-dinosaur Earth is that it was essentially a giant reset button for evolution. All the ecological niches that had been occupied by large dinosaurs were suddenly vacant. It was like having every apartment in a massive city suddenly become available at the same time. The small mammals, birds, reptiles, and other creatures that survived the extinction were about to experience the ultimate real estate boom, but the recovery wasn't immediate. The first million years after the extinction event, known as the Paleocene epoch, were characterized by what scientists call the disaster fauna. These were communities of opportunistic species that could survive in harsh conditions and reproduce quickly. Think of them as the ecological equivalent of pioneer species that colonize disturbed habitats today. During this time, the climate was still recovering from the impact winter caused by debris in the atmosphere. Temperatures were cooler than they had been during the late Cretaceous, and seasonal variations were more extreme. Many plant species had also gone extinct, so the survivors had to adapt to new food sources and changed environments. The mammals that emerged from their underground shelters were unlike anything alive today. Most were small, about the size of rats or squirrels, with simple teeth adapted for eating insects, small animals, and whatever plant matter they could find. They had large eyes adapted for nocturnal life, since they had spent the entire age of dinosaurs hiding in the darkness, avoiding the giant reptilian predators that dominated the daylight hours. These early mammals had been living in the shadows for over 100 million years. While dinosaurs ruled the surface, mammals had been restricted to nighttime activity and small body sizes. They were the ultimate underdogs, and suddenly they found themselves in a world where being small was no longer a disadvantage. But here's where the story gets really interesting. These mammals didn't just survive, they exploded into diversity. Within just 10 million years after the extinction, mammals had diversified into dozens of new forms. Some remained small and agile, but others began to experiment with larger body sizes. For the first time in mammalian history, there were no giant predatory dinosaurs to keep them in check. The early Paleocene world was dominated by what paleontologists call archaic mammals. These were groups that don't have any close modern relatives. There were multituberculates, which looked somewhat like large rodents, but were actually more closely related to modern monotremes like platypuses. There were condylarths, early hoofed mammals that would eventually give rise to all modern ungulates. There were creodonts, primitive carnivorous mammals that filled the predator niches left vacant by dinosaurs. One of the most remarkable things about this period was how quickly mammals began to diversify. The fossil record shows an explosion of new species, new body forms, and new ecological strategies. It's as if evolution had been waiting for this moment to unleash all the potential that had been bottled up during the age of dinosaurs. But mammals weren't the only survivors making the most of this new world. Birds, which are actually dinosaurs themselves, were also beginning to diversify rapidly. The few lineages that survived the extinction quickly radiated into new forms. Some remained small and arboreal, but others began to experiment with ground-dwelling lifestyles and larger body sizes. In fact, for a brief period after the extinction, it looked like birds might become the dominant large animals on Earth. In South America, giant flightless birds called phorusrhacids, or terror birds, evolved to fill the role of apex predators. These massive birds, some standing over 10 feet tall, had enormous hooked beaks and powerful legs that allowed them to run down prey with terrifying efficiency. The plant communities were also undergoing dramatic changes. Many of the dominant Cretaceous plants, including various conifers and flowering plants, had gone extinct. The survivors included ferns, which are particularly good at colonizing disturbed environments, and certain groups of flowering plants that could tolerate the changed climate conditions. Interestingly, fossil evidence suggests that fungi played a much larger role in early Paleocene ecosystems than they do today. In some locations, paleontologists have found evidence of massive fungal decomposers that may have formed forest-like structures as they broke down the enormous amounts of dead plant and animal matter left over from the extinction event. The marine environment was equally transformed. With marine reptiles gone, new groups of animals began to explore oceanic niches. Early whales, which were still four-legged land animals at this point, were beginning the evolutionary journey that would eventually take them back to the sea. Sharks and bony fish were diversifying to fill the roles once occupied by marine reptiles. But perhaps the most significant change was happening in the microscopic world. The extinction had also affected marine phytoplankton, the tiny organisms that form the base of oceanic food webs. As these communities recovered and evolved, they set the stage for the recovery of larger marine ecosystems. The climate during the early Paleocene was generally warm and humid, but it was also unstable. The planet was still recovering from the disruption caused by the asteroid impact, and atmospheric composition was changing as new plant communities established themselves and began influencing global carbon cycles. This climatic instability actually drove evolutionary innovation. Species that could adapt to changing conditions had a significant advantage, and this selective pressure led to rapid evolutionary change. Many of the fundamental mammalian adaptations that we see today, including improved brain function, better thermoregulation, and more efficient digestive systems, evolved during this period of environmental uncertainty. As we move deeper into the Paleocene, around 60 million years ago, we begin to see the emergence of the first truly large mammals. Animals like Barolambda, a massive plant eater that weighed as much as a small elephant, showed that mammals were no longer restricted to small body sizes. These early giants were still quite different from modern large mammals, but they represented a crucial step in mammalian evolution. The diversification wasn't just about size though. Mammals were also experimenting with new ways of life. Some took to the trees, developing the grasping hands and improved vision that would eventually characterize primates. Others adapted to aquatic environments, beginning the long evolutionary journey toward fully marine lifestyles. Still others specialized for digging, developing the powerful claws and robust bodies that we see in modern burrowing mammals. This period of rapid diversification set the stage for everything that would follow. The mammals that emerged from the post-extinction recovery would eventually give rise to all modern mammalian groups, including our own primate lineage. The birds that survived would diversify into the incredible variety we see today. Even the plants and marine organisms that recovered during this time would form the foundation of modern ecosystems. But the story was far from over. The world that emerged from the ashes of the dinosaur extinction was just the beginning of an evolutionary journey that would ultimately lead to the rich, complex ecosystems we know today. In the next part of this series, we'll explore how these early survivors continue to evolve and diversify, setting the stage for some of the most remarkable creatures our planet has ever seen. What happened next is where this story takes a turn that will absolutely blow your mind, because around 56 million years ago, our planet experienced something so extreme, so dramatic, that it makes today's climate change look like a gentle spring breeze. Scientists call it the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, or PETM for short, and it represents one of the most rapid warming events in Earth's entire history. Picture this. In less than 200,000 years, which is basically an instant in geological time, global temperatures skyrocketed by 9 to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. The Arctic Ocean, which today is locked in ice, became as warm as a modern subtropical sea. Palm trees were growing in Alaska. Crocodiles were basking on the shores of Greenland. It was a greenhouse world, unlike anything humans have ever experienced. But here's what makes this event absolutely fascinating from an evolutionary perspective. Instead of wiping out life, this extreme warming actually supercharged evolution. The PETM became the catalyst for one of the most explosive periods of diversification in mammalian history. It's as if someone had pressed the fast-forward button on evolution itself. The cause of this dramatic warming is still debated by scientists, but the leading theory involves massive releases of carbon into the atmosphere. Some researchers believe it was triggered by volcanic activity in the North Atlantic, while others point to the sudden release of methane hydrates from the ocean floor. Whatever the cause, the result was a planet that transformed almost overnight into a tropical paradise. And the mammals, they went absolutely wild. This warming event marked the beginning of what we call the Eocene epoch, and it was during this time that mammals truly came into their own. The small, rat-like creatures that had survived the dinosaur extinction were now evolving into forms that would look surprisingly familiar to us today. Let me paint you a picture of what the Eocene world looked like. Imagine stepping into a time machine and emerging in what is now Wyoming, about 50 million years ago. You'd find yourself in a lush tropical rainforest filled with palm trees, cycads, and flowering plants that seem almost alien. The air is thick and humid like a modern greenhouse. Strange calls echo through the canopy from creatures you've never seen before. In the trees above you, early primates are swinging from branch to branch. These aren't quite monkeys or apes as we know them today, but they're recognizably our distant relatives. They have grasping hands, forward-facing eyes for judging distances, and the beginnings of the complex social behaviors that characterize modern primates. On the forest floor, you might encounter Coryphodon, a massive plant eater about the size of a hippo, but with a brain roughly the size of a walnut. These early giants were still figuring out how to be large mammals, and many of them had body proportions that seem almost comical by modern standards. But they were pioneers, testing the limits of how big a warm-blooded animal could grow. In the undergrowth, small horses no bigger than house cats are browsing on leaves. Yes, horses. But these early equids, like Hyracotherium, had 4 toes on their front feet and 3 on their back feet. They were forest dwellers, perfectly adapted for navigating through dense vegetation. The grasslands that would eventually shape horse evolution were still millions of years in the future. But perhaps the most remarkable inhabitants of this Eocene world were the early whales. And here's where the story gets truly mind-bending. These whales still had legs. Ambulosaurus, whose name literally means walking whale, was about 12 feet long and spent part of its time on land and part in the water. It looked like a cross between a wolf and a crocodile, with powerful limbs for walking and a long tail for swimming. These early whales represent one of the most dramatic evolutionary transitions in the history of life. In just 15 million years, they went from being 4-legged land mammals to fully aquatic giants. The fossil record of this transformation is so complete that scientists can trace almost every step of the journey from land to sea. The oceans themselves were undergoing their own revolution. With the marine reptiles gone, new predators were evolving to fill those niches. Early sharks were diversifying into new forms, including some truly massive species. The first baleen whales were beginning to filter feed on the abundant plankton in the warming seas. Even the seafloors were changing as new communities of organisms adapted to the altered ocean chemistry. But the land was where the real action was happening. The warm, humid climate created perfect conditions for forest expansion, and these forests became evolutionary laboratories where new forms of life were constantly emerging. Early bats were taking to the skies, developing the sophisticated echolocation systems that would make them masters of the night. Early carnivores were experimenting with different hunting strategies, leading to the evolution of the first true cats and dogs. One group that really thrived during this period were the pterodactyls, the odd-toed ungulates. This group includes modern horses, rhinos, and tapirs, but in the Eocene, they were incredibly diverse. There were tiny forest horses, massive rhino-like browsers, and even some species that looked like crosses between horses and tapirs. They were the dominant large herbivores of their time, filling ecological roles that would later be taken over by even-toed ungulates, like cattle and deer. The even-toed ungulates, or artiodactyls, were also beginning to appear during this time, though they were still relatively small and uncommon. The first members of this group looked nothing like modern cattle or pigs. They were small, forest-dwelling creatures with simple teeth, adapted for browsing on leaves and soft plant material. Perhaps most remarkably, the Eocene saw the emergence of the first proboscideans, the group that includes modern elephants. But these early elephant relatives were nothing like the giants we know today. Merytherium was only about 3 feet tall and looked more like a large pig with a slightly elongated snout. It lived in swamps and rivers, using its proto-trunk to gather aquatic vegetation. The bird world was equally dynamic. The terrorbirds I mentioned earlier were reaching their peak during this period, with some species growing to massive sizes, but they weren't the only large birds around. Early relatives of modern cranes, storks, and other wading birds were diversifying in the extensive wetlands that covered much of the planet. In the air, competition was fierce. Early bats were developing increasingly sophisticated flight capabilities and echolocation systems, but they had to share the skies with large flightless birds and even some gliding mammals that were experimenting with powered flight. The plant world was also experiencing its own renaissance. The warming climate allowed tropical plants to spread much further north and south than they can today. Rainforests extended almost to the poles, creating a connected belt of forest habitat that allowed animals to migrate across vast distances. This global forest coverage had profound effects on atmospheric composition. The abundant plant life was pulling massive amounts of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But the warm, humid conditions also promoted rapid decomposition, which released carbon back into the air. It was a delicate balance that kept the planet in its greenhouse state. But here's what's truly remarkable about the Eocene. Despite the extreme warmth, life was flourishing. There were no ice caps anywhere on the planet. Sea levels were hundreds of feet higher than today, and yet biodiversity was exploding. It challenges our assumptions about how life responds to rapid climate change and shows that under the right conditions, warming can actually promote evolutionary innovation. The fossil sites from this period read like a catalogue of evolutionary experiments. In Germany, the Messel Pit preserves an entire Eocene ecosystem in exquisite detail. Scientists have found everything from early horses and bats to primitive primates, and even stomach contents of ancient animals. It's like having a snapshot of life 47 million years ago. In Wyoming, the Green River Formation tells a similar story of abundance and diversity. The fossils there include perfectly preserved fish, insects, plants, and even bird feathers with their original colors intact. These sites give us an incredibly detailed picture of what life was like during this crucial period in mammalian evolution. As the Eocene progressed, around 40 million years ago, something began to change. The extreme warmth that had characterized the early part of this epoch started to moderate. The planet was beginning a long, slow cooling trend that would eventually lead to ice ages. This cooling would drive the next major phase of mammalian evolution, but that's a story for another time. What's clear is that the Eocene represents a pivotal moment in the history of life on Earth. It was during this period that many of the major mammalian groups we know today first appeared and began to diversify. Without the extreme warming of the PTM and the greenhouse conditions of the Eocene, mammalian evolution might have taken a completely different path. The mammals that emerged from this hothouse world were no longer the small, scurrying creatures that had survived the dinosaur extinction. They were becoming the diverse, successful group that would eventually produce everything from tiny shrews to massive whales, from soaring bats to intelligent primates. But the story of post-dinosaur Earth is far from over. As the climate began to cool and new challenges emerged, these Eocene mammals would face their own tests of survival and adaptation. The stage was being set for the next great chapter in the history of life, one that would see the rise of grasslands, the evolution of running animals, and eventually the emergence of our own lineage. The cooling that began in the late Eocene wasn't gradual like a gentle autumn breeze. It was more like someone had started slowly turning down the thermostat on the entire planet. And just like when you adjust the temperature in your house, everything inside had to adapt or find a new place to live. This transition marks the beginning of what scientists call the Oligocene epoch, around 34 million years ago. And here's where our story takes another dramatic turn. The lush tropical forests that had covered most of the planet during the Eocene began to shrink. The palm trees that had grown in Alaska started to disappear. The crocodiles basking in Greenland either migrated south or went extinct. But nature abhors a vacuum, and as the forest retreated, something entirely new began to emerge. For the first time in Earth's history, vast expanses of grassland started to spread across the continents. These weren't the manicured lawns we see today. These were wild, endless prairies that stretched to the horizon, creating completely new opportunities for life. Now, you might think grass is boring. After all, it's just grass, right? But the evolution of grasslands represents one of the most revolutionary changes in the history of terrestrial life. Grass is incredibly tough stuff. It grows from the bottom up, so when an animal eats the top, it just keeps growing. It can survive droughts, fires, and constant grazing pressure. And most importantly, it could thrive in the cooler, drier conditions that were becoming more common as the planet continued to cool. The spread of grasslands created what paleontologists call the savanna hypothesis environment. Open spaces with scattered trees, perfect for a new kind of evolutionary arms race. Animals that could run fast had a huge advantage in these open environments. There was nowhere to hide, so speed became everything. And the mammals responded in spectacular fashion. This is when we start to see the evolution of some truly remarkable running machines. The horses, which had been small forest browsers with multiple toes, began to change dramatically. Their legs got longer. Their bodies became more streamlined. And here's the really fascinating part. They started losing their toes. Hyracotherium, that cat-sized forest horse from the Eocene, gave way to larger species like Mesohippus, which had 3 toes but was already starting to put most of its weight on the middle toe. This was the beginning of one of the most famous evolutionary sequences in the fossil record. Over millions of years, horses would continue to get larger, faster, and more specialized for running on hard ground. But horses weren't the only ones adapting to this new grassland world. The artiodactyls, those even-toed ungulates that had been minor players during the Eocene, suddenly found their moment to shine. Early members of what would become the deer, antelope, and cattle families began to diversify rapidly. They developed long legs for running, complex digestive systems for processing tough grasses, and increasingly sophisticated social behaviors. One group that really exemplifies this grassland revolution is the oreodonts. These pig-like animals became incredibly abundant during the Oligocene, with some species forming massive herds that roamed the expanding prairies. Fossil evidence suggests that some oreodont herds numbered in the thousands, creating the first truly massive gatherings of large mammals since the dinosaur extinction. The predators, of course, couldn't let all this prey evolution go unanswered. This period saw the rise of some truly formidable carnivores. The creodonts, those primitive carnivorous mammals from the Paleocene, were being replaced by more modern carnivore groups. Early cats were becoming more sophisticated hunters, developing the retractable claws and powerful jaw muscles that would make them such effective predators. But perhaps the most impressive predators of the Oligocene were the bear dogs, or amphicyonids. These weren't actually related to either bears or dogs, despite their name. They were their own unique group of carnivores that combined the size and power of bears with the speed and agility of wolves. Some species grew to massive sizes, with skulls over a foot long and powerful enough to crack the bones of the largest herbivores. The cooling climate was also having dramatic effects on plant evolution. Grasses weren't the only plants adapting to the new conditions. Many flowering plants were evolving new strategies for surviving in drier, more seasonal environments. Deciduous trees, which lose their leaves in winter, became much more common. This was a major adaptation to the increasingly seasonal climate that was replacing the constant warmth of the Eocene. In the oceans, equally dramatic changes were taking place. The cooling temperatures were driving the formation of the first permanent ice caps in Antarctica. This had a cascading effect on ocean circulation patterns, creating new currents and changing the distribution of nutrients in the sea. The whales that had evolved during the Eocene were continuing their remarkable transformation. The early walking whales like Ambulocetus were being replaced by fully aquatic forms. Basilosaurus, a serpentine whale over 60 feet long, dominated the Oligocene oceans. These early whales had tiny hind limbs that were probably useless for locomotion, but served as a reminder of their terrestrial origins. At the same time, the first baleen whales were appearing. These filter-feeding giants represented a completely new way of life in the oceans. Instead of hunting individual prey like their toothed cousins, they evolved the ability to strain enormous volumes of water through their baleen plates, capturing tiny organisms in massive quantities. This innovation would eventually allow whales to grow to sizes that dwarf even the largest dinosaurs. But let's return to land, because this is where some of the most dramatic evolutionary experiments were taking place. The cooling climate and expanding grasslands were creating new ecological niches faster than evolution could fill them. It was like having a massive construction boom where new neighborhoods were being built faster than people could move into them. One of the most successful groups during this time were the rodents. These small mammals had been relatively minor players during the age of dinosaurs, but they absolutely exploded in diversity during the Oligocene. Early beavers were building their first dams, creating wetland habitats that supported entire ecosystems. Squirrels were adapting to life in the trees, developing the acrobatic skills that make them such successful arboreal mammals today. The primates, our own distant relatives, were facing some challenges during this cooling period. The tropical forests they preferred were shrinking, forcing many species to either adapt to new environments or face extinction. Some early primates did manage to colonize the expanding woodlands, but many groups that had thrived during the Eocene simply disappeared from the fossil record. However, in Africa, something remarkable was happening. The cooling climate there created a mosaic of forests and grasslands that would prove to be crucial for primate evolution. Early apes were beginning to appear, experimenting with new forms of locomotion and social organization. These African primates were setting the stage for one of the most important evolutionary stories of all, the eventual emergence of our own lineage. The Oligocene also saw the rise of some truly bizarre evolutionary experiments. Indricotheres, the largest land mammals that ever lived, were roaming the grasslands of Asia. These giant rhino relatives stood 18 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed as much as 4 modern elephants. They were browsers, using their long necks to reach high into trees, much like modern giraffes do today. In South America, which was still an island continent at this time, evolution was taking some particularly strange turns. Glyptodonts, armored mammals that looked like giant armadillos the size of small cars, were beginning to diversify. Ground sloths were growing to enormous sizes, some eventually reaching the proportions of elephants. And the terror birds were reaching their absolute peak, with some species standing over 10 feet tall and capable of crushing the bones of large mammals with their massive beaks. The isolation of South America created what scientists call a natural experiment in evolution. Without the competitive pressure from the more advanced mammals evolving in other continents, South American fauna developed along completely unique lines. This would continue for millions of years until the eventual formation of the Panama land bridge would bring these isolated ecosystems into contact with the rest of the world. Back in North America and Eurasia, the grassland revolution was accelerating. The climate was becoming not just cooler, but also more seasonal. Winters were getting colder, summers were becoming drier, and rainfall was becoming more erratic. These changes put enormous selective pressure on all forms of life. Plants had to develop new strategies for surviving dry seasons and cold winters. Animals had to adapt to feast or famine cycles, where abundant food in summer had to sustain them through harsh winters. This seasonal pressure drove the evolution of migration patterns, hibernation behaviors, and food storage strategies that we still see in modern animals. The cooling trend wasn't uniform across the planet. Some regions became much drier, leading to the formation of the first true deserts since the age of dinosaurs. Other areas remained relatively moist, but developed distinct wet and dry seasons. This climatic diversity created a patchwork of different habitats, each with its own unique evolutionary pressures. One of the most significant developments during the late Oligocene was the continued expansion of Antarctic ice sheets. As more and more of the planet's water became locked up in ice, global sea levels began to drop significantly. This exposed new land bridges and created new barriers to ocean circulation. The world was becoming more geographically complex, with more isolated continents and distinct climate zones. This geographic complexity had profound effects on evolution. Populations of animals became isolated on different continents, leading to the independent evolution of similar forms in different places. This phenomenon, called convergent evolution, would become increasingly important as the continents continued to drift apart and develop their own unique faunas. The Oligocene epoch was setting the stage for even more dramatic changes to come. The cooling trend that had begun would continue, eventually leading to the ice ages that would dominate the later chapters of Earth's history. The grasslands that first appeared during this time would continue to expand, creating the vast prairies and savannas that would shape the evolution of some of the most magnificent animals our planet has ever seen. But perhaps most importantly, the Oligocene established the basic template for modern ecosystems. The predator-prey relationships, the plant-animal interactions, and the complex food webs that characterize today's natural world all have their roots in this crucial period of Earth's history. As we move forward through geological time, the mammals that survived and thrived during the Oligocene would continue to evolve and diversify. Some would grow to enormous sizes, others would develop incredible speed and agility, some would take to the air, others would return to the sea. The evolutionary experiments that began in the aftermath of the dinosaur extinction were reaching full maturity, creating a world that was becoming recognizably modern in its complexity and diversity. The stage was now set for the next great chapter in the story of life on Earth. The mammals had proven they could not only survive in a post-dinosaur world, they could dominate it. But the planet wasn't finished changing, and neither were the remarkable creatures that called it home. As we ventured deeper into the Oligocene, around 30 million years ago, something absolutely extraordinary was happening beneath the surface of all this grassland expansion and mammalian diversification. The planet was conducting its own massive chemistry experiment, one that would fundamentally alter the composition of the atmosphere and set the stage for dramatic evolutionary leaps that were still to come. You see, all those new grasslands weren't just changing the landscape visually, they were transforming the very air that animals breathed. Grasses are incredibly efficient at pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere during photosynthesis. But here's the fascinating part. Unlike the lush tropical forests of the Eocene, grasslands store most of their carbon underground in their extensive root systems rather than in above-ground biomass. This meant that as grasslands spread across millions of square miles of the planet's surface, they were effectively acting like enormous carbon vacuum cleaners, sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere and locking it away in soil organic matter. The result was a dramatic drop in atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, from around 1,000 parts per million during the Eocene to less than 500 parts per million by the end of the Oligocene. Now, you might think this sounds like a good thing. After all, we're constantly hearing about carbon dioxide and climate change today. But for the animals living 30 million years ago, this atmospheric transformation created both incredible opportunities and deadly challenges. The lower CO2 levels meant that plants had to work harder to photosynthesize. This led to the evolution of what scientists call C4 photosynthesis, a more efficient way of capturing carbon from the atmosphere. The plants that developed this new biochemistry had a massive advantage in the drier, CO2-depleted world of the late Oligocene. They could grow faster, survive droughts better, and produce more nutritious food for the herbivores that depended on them. But here's where it gets really interesting. This change in plant biochemistry created a new kind of evolutionary arms race. The herbivores that could digest these new, tougher grasses had access to abundant food sources across the expanding grasslands. Those that couldn't were restricted to shrinking forest habitats or faced extinction. This is when we start to see the evolution of some truly remarkable digestive systems. Ruminants, the group that includes modern cattle, deer, and antelope, developed their complex multi-chambered stomachs during this period. These elaborate digestive systems, complete with specialized bacteria that could break down cellulose, allowed ruminants to extract nutrition from plant material that other mammals simply couldn't process. The horses were taking a different approach. Instead of developing complex stomachs, they evolved increasingly sophisticated teeth. Their molars became higher crowned and more ridged, perfect for grinding tough, abrasive grasses. This dental evolution was so dramatic that paleontologists can trace the expansion of grasslands across North America just by looking at the changing tooth structure of fossil horses. Meanwhile, the carnivores were facing their own evolutionary challenges. The open grasslands provided little cover for ambush predators, so hunting strategies had to evolve accordingly. This led to the development of pack hunting behaviors and pursuit predation. Early members of the dog family began to work together to bring down prey, developing the complex social structures that we see in modern wolves and wild dogs. But perhaps the most remarkable development during this time was happening in Africa, where the cooling climate was creating a unique mosaic of habitats. The continent was becoming a patchwork of forests, woodlands, and grasslands, providing the perfect evolutionary laboratory for one of the most important developments in the history of life on Earth. It was in these African environments that the first true apes were beginning to appear. Proconsul, an early ape that lived around 25 million years ago, was experimenting with new forms of locomotion. Unlike the quadrupedal monkeys that dominated the trees, these early apes were developing the ability to swing from branch to branch using their arms, a form of movement called brachiation. This might seem like a small change, but it was actually revolutionary. Brachiation required significant modifications to the shoulder joint, the rib cage, and the spine. These anatomical changes would eventually prove crucial for the evolution of upright walking, though that development was still millions of years in the future. The cooling climate was also having profound effects on brain evolution across multiple mammalian groups. The seasonal environments of the Oligocene required animals to be much more flexible in their behavior. They needed to remember where food sources were located during different seasons, navigate across vast territories, and coordinate complex social behaviors. This environmental complexity was driving the evolution of larger, more sophisticated brains. Early primates were developing enhanced visual processing capabilities to navigate three-dimensional forest environments. Carnivores were evolving better spatial memory and problem-solving abilities to track prey across open landscapes. Even herbivores were developing more complex social cognition to coordinate herd movements and avoid predators. But the brain evolution wasn't limited to mammals. Birds were also responding to the changing world with remarkable cognitive advances. The ancestors of modern crows and parrots were developing the problem-solving abilities and tool use capabilities that make these groups so intelligent today. Some bird species were even beginning to exhibit what scientists call theory of mind, the ability to understand that other individuals have their own thoughts and intentions. The marine environment was undergoing its own dramatic transformation during this time. The formation of the Antarctic ice sheet wasn't just locking up water and lowering sea levels. It was also fundamentally altering ocean circulation patterns around the globe. The Southern Ocean around Antarctica became isolated by the powerful circumpolar current, creating what scientists call the thermal isolation of the continent. This allowed Antarctica to become even colder, which promoted further ice growth in a positive feedback loop. Meanwhile, the altered ocean currents were changing the distribution of nutrients in the world's oceans. These oceanic changes had cascading effects on marine life. The whales that had evolved during the Eocene were diversifying into the major groups we recognize today. Toothed whales were becoming increasingly sophisticated echolocators, developing the biosonar systems that would make them such effective hunters. Baleen whales were growing larger and more specialized, with different species evolving to feed on different types of plankton and small fish. The cooling oceans were also promoting the evolution of new feeding strategies. Some whale species began following the seasonal migrations of their prey, developing the long-distance migration patterns that we see in modern species like grey whales and humpback whales. These migrations, some covering thousands of miles, required sophisticated navigation abilities and precise timing. Back on land, the late Oligocene was witnessing the rise of some truly spectacular evolutionary experiments. In North America, the oreodonts had reached their peak diversity, with dozens of species ranging from pig-sized browsers to massive hippo-like grazers. Some species developed elongated limbs for running across open grasslands, while others became semi-aquatic, spending much of their time in rivers and lakes. The carnivore guilds were also reaching new levels of complexity. Bear dogs were diversifying into numerous forms, from small fox-like species to massive, bone-crushing giants. Early cats were experimenting with different hunting strategies, leading to the evolution of both ambush predators with powerful builds and pursuit predators with long legs and slender bodies. But perhaps the most impressive predators of the late Oligocene were found in South America, where evolution was taking some truly extraordinary turns. The terror birds had reached their absolute zenith, with species like Brontornis standing over 8 feet tall and weighing more than 800 pounds. These massive predators had skulls nearly 2 feet long and beaks that could deliver bone-crushing blows with the force of a sledgehammer. The South American mammals were also producing some remarkable forms. Early ground sloths were growing to enormous sizes, with some species approaching the bulk of modern elephants. These weren't the slow-moving creatures their name suggests, but active browsers and grazers that could rear up on their hind legs to reach high vegetation. The glyptodonts, those armored mammals I mentioned earlier, were also diversifying rapidly. Some species developed club-like tails that could be used as weapons, while others evolved spikes and knobs on their armor for protection against predators. The largest glyptodonts were the size of small cars, with armor so thick that it could deflect the attacks of even the largest terror birds. Meanwhile, in Australia, which had been isolated from other continents for millions of years, marsupials were undergoing their own remarkable evolutionary radiation. Early kangaroos were diversifying into forms that range from tiny forest browsers to large grassland grazers. Some species were even experimenting with carnivory, developing the sharp teeth and powerful jaws needed to hunt other marsupials. The monotremes, that bizarre group of egg-laying mammals that includes modern platypuses and echidnas, were also more diverse during the Oligocene than they are today. Fossil evidence suggests that there were several species of large echidnas, some approaching the size of sheep, that browsed on vegetation in Australian woodlands. As the Oligocene drew to a close, around 23 million years ago, the stage was set for even more dramatic changes. The cooling trend that had begun in the Eocene was continuing, and the planet was heading toward the ice ages that would dominate the later Cenozoic era. But the mammals, birds, and other creatures that had evolved during this crucial period had proven their ability to adapt to changing conditions. The grassland revolution that began during the Oligocene had fundamentally transformed terrestrial ecosystems. The predator-prey relationships, migration patterns, and seasonal behaviors that evolved during this time would continue to shape animal evolution for millions of years to come. The complex digestive systems, sophisticated brains, and specialized locomotor adaptations that appeared during the Oligocene became the foundation for the incredible diversity of mammals we see today. But the story was far from over. As we move into the Miocene epoch, which began 23 million years ago, we'll see the continuation and acceleration of many of the trends that started during the Oligocene. The grasslands would continue to expand, the climate would become even more seasonal, and the evolutionary arms races between predators and prey would reach new levels of sophistication. The mammals that emerged from the Oligocene were no longer the small generalized creatures that had survived the dinosaur extinction. They were becoming the specialized, diverse, and successful group that would eventually dominate terrestrial ecosystems around the world. Some would grow to enormous sizes, others would develop incredible speed and agility, and still others would begin the long evolutionary journey that would eventually lead to the emergence of human intelligence. The Oligocene epoch represents a crucial turning point in the history of life on Earth. It was during this time that the modern world began to take shape, with its complex ecosystems, seasonal climates, and diverse communities of specialized organisms. The evolutionary innovations that appeared during the Oligocene, from advanced digestive systems to sophisticated social behaviors, became the building blocks for all future mammalian evolution. As we prepare to explore the next chapter in this remarkable story, it's worth pausing to appreciate just how far life had come since the asteroid impact that ended the age of dinosaurs. In just 40 million years, mammals had transformed from small, nocturnal creatures hiding in the shadows to the dominant large animals on every continent. They had conquered land, sea, and air, developing an incredible array of adaptations that allowed them to thrive in virtually every environment on Earth. But the most remarkable developments were still to come. The cooling climate and expanding grasslands of the Oligocene had set the stage for evolutionary innovations that would eventually lead to some of the most magnificent creatures our planet has ever seen. The Age of Giants was about to begin, and with it would come new challenges, new opportunities, and new evolutionary experiments that would continue to reshape the living world. The Miocene epoch, beginning 23 million years ago, opened like a curtain rising on the greatest show Earth had ever staged. If the Oligocene had been a dress rehearsal for the age of mammals, the Miocene was opening night, and the performers were about to deliver the most spectacular display of evolutionary artistry the planet had ever witnessed. Picture this. You're standing on what will one day become the Great Plains of North America, but the landscape before you defies imagination. Endless grasslands stretch to every horizon, but these aren't the quiet prairies you might expect. The ground trembles beneath your feet from the thunderous hoofbeats of massive herds. The air fills with dust clouds that stretch for miles as thousands upon thousands of animals move across the landscape in migrations that dwarf anything in the modern world. But here's what will absolutely blow your mind. The creatures creating this spectacle are unlike anything alive today. Imagine horses, but not the elegant thoroughbreds we know. These are Hipparion, three-toed horses that travel in herds numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Their hoofbeats create a rhythmic percussion that can be heard for miles, a drumbeat of evolution in action. And they're not alone. Sharing these grasslands are animals so bizarre, so magnificently adapted to their world, that they seem like creatures from another planet. Synthetoxeras, a relative of modern deer, sports not just antlers, but a bizarre Y-shaped horn projecting from its nose. Dinotherium, an early elephant relative, has tusks that curve downward from its lower jaw, creating one of the most unusual feeding adaptations in mammalian history. But the real stars of this Miocene spectacular are the rhinoceroses. And when I say stars, I mean it literally. These weren't the bulky, armor-plated rhinos we know today. Teleoceras was built like a living tank crossed with a hippo, spending much of its time wallowing in rivers and lakes. But the truly mind-blowing species was Paraceratherium, which I mentioned briefly before, but now we need to truly appreciate its magnificence. Standing 18 feet tall at the shoulder and stretching 24 feet from nose to tail, Paraceratherium wasn't just the largest land mammal that ever lived. It was a creature so massive that it redefined what was possible for a terrestrial animal. Its neck alone was longer than an entire modern horse. When it stretched up to browse, it could reach vegetation 26 feet off the ground. To put that in perspective, a 2-story building would barely reach its feeding height. These giants weren't lumbering behemoths either. Evidence suggests they could move at surprising speeds when necessary, their long legs carrying them across vast distances in search of the enormous quantities of vegetation they needed to survive. A single adult probably consumed over 600 pounds of plant material every day, reshaping entire landscapes through their feeding behavior. The Miocene climate was creating perfect conditions for these evolutionary experiments. Global temperatures were warmer than today, but not as hot as the Eocene greenhouse. More importantly, the climate was becoming increasingly seasonal, with distinct wet and dry periods that drove animal behavior and evolution in fascinating new directions. This seasonality created what scientists call the migration imperative. Animals that could move long distances to follow seasonal resources had enormous advantages over those that couldn't. This pressure drove the evolution of some of the most impressive migration systems in Earth's history. The horse herds of the Miocene weren't just wandering aimlessly across the grasslands. They were following sophisticated seasonal patterns, moving hundreds of miles between summer and winter ranges. These migrations were so regular and predictable that they carved permanent trails across the landscape, some of which can still be detected in the geological record today. But the herbivores weren't the only ones adapting to this new world of seasonal abundance and scarcity. The carnivores were evolving their own remarkable strategies for dealing with the boom and bust cycles of grassland life. And this is where the story takes a turn towards some of the most fearsome predators our planet has ever known. Enter Amphision, the bear dog that reached its evolutionary peak during the Miocene. Picture a creature with the size and power of a grizzly bear, but the speed and agility of a wolf. Some species of Amphision grew to over 1,500 pounds, making them larger than any modern bear. But unlike bears, they were built for pursuit hunting, with long legs and a streamlined body that could sustain high speeds over long distances. These weren't solitary hunters either. Fossil evidence suggests that some Amphision species hunted in coordinated packs, using sophisticated strategies to bring down prey much larger than themselves. Imagine a pack of bear-sized predators working together to hunt those massive Miocene rhinos. It was predation on a scale that modern ecosystems simply cannot match. The cats were also reaching new levels of evolutionary sophistication during this period. Pseudolurus, an early member of the cat family, was experimenting with the hunting techniques that would eventually make cats such successful predators. But the most remarkable feline evolution was happening with the development of the first saber-toothed cats. Now, when most people hear saber-toothed cat, they think of Smilodon, the famous Ice Age predator. But the Miocene saber-teeth were actually more diverse and in some ways more impressive than their later relatives. Barbarophilus had canine teeth over 6 inches long, perfectly adapted for slicing through the thick hides of massive herbivores. These weren't just oversized fangs either. They were precision instruments, evolved to deliver killing bites to specific vulnerable spots on their prey. The hunting strategies of these saber-toothed cats were unlike anything we see in modern predators. Instead of the strangling bite used by modern big cats, saber-teeth delivered slashing attacks that severed major blood vessels and caused rapid blood loss. It was a brutal but highly effective technique for dealing with the heavily built herbivores of the Miocene. But perhaps the most remarkable carnivore story of the Miocene was happening in the oceans, where a predator was evolving that would make even the largest terrestrial carnivores look tame by comparison. Carcharacal's megalodon, the giant shark that has captured popular imagination, was reaching its evolutionary peak during this period. These weren't just big sharks. They were oceanic monsters measuring up to 60 feet in length, with teeth the size of dinner plates and bite forces that exceeded those of Tyrannosaurus rex. Megalodon could bite through the skull of a whale with the same ease that a modern great white bites through a fish. The oceans of the Miocene were ruled by predators that dwarf anything alive today. The whales themselves were responding to this predation pressure by evolving new defensive strategies. Early baleen whales were growing to enormous sizes, developing the bulk that would make them difficult prey even for megalodons. Some species were also evolving more sophisticated echolocation abilities, allowing them to detect approaching predators from greater distances. Meanwhile, the toothed whales were diversifying into forms that seem almost alien by modern standards. Leviathan melvillei was a sperm whale, relative with teeth over a foot long, capable of hunting other whales. These oceanic predator-prey relationships were operating on scales that modern marine ecosystems cannot match. Back on land, the Miocene was witnessing evolutionary innovations that would have profound implications for the future of life on Earth. In Africa, the cooling and drying climate was creating new selective pressures that would drive one of the most important evolutionary developments in the history of our planet. The early apes that had appeared during the Oligocene were facing a crisis. The tropical forests they preferred were shrinking as the climate became more seasonal and arid. Many lineages simply went extinct, unable to adapt to the changing conditions. But some populations found themselves in a unique situation that would change the course of evolutionary history. In East Africa, geological forces were creating the Great Rift Valley, a massive crack in the Earth's crust that was fundamentally altering local climate patterns. The western side of the rift remained relatively forested, while the eastern side was becoming increasingly open and grassland dominated. Some ape populations found themselves living right at this boundary, in environments that were neither fully forested nor completely open. These edge environments created unprecedented evolutionary pressures. The apes living there couldn't rely entirely on the arboreal lifestyle of their forest-dwelling relatives, but they also couldn't fully commit to terrestrial life like the grassland specialists. They had to develop new strategies for survival that combined the best of both worlds. This is where we start to see the first experiments with bipedalism. Standing upright wasn't initially about walking long distances across open grasslands. It was about being able to see over tall grass while still maintaining the ability to climb trees when necessary. These early experiments with upright posture were setting the stage for one of the most dramatic evolutionary transformations in the history of life. But the African story wasn't just about early human ancestors. The continent was becoming an evolutionary laboratory for all kinds of remarkable creatures. Early elephants were diversifying into forms that would dominate African ecosystems for millions of years. Dinotherium, with its bizarre downward curving tusks, was using these unusual tools to strip bark from trees and dig up roots. The Proboscidean family tree was exploding with diversity during the Miocene. There were gomphotheres with 4 tusks and extended jaws, mastodonts with elaborate grinding teeth, and early mammoth relatives that were beginning to adapt to cooler climates. Each lineage was experimenting with different feeding strategies and habitat preferences, creating an elephant diversity that far exceeded anything in the modern world. The carnivores of Miocene Africa were equally impressive. Early members of the hyena family were evolving the bone-crushing capabilities that would make them such successful scavengers and hunters. But these weren't the spotted hyenas we know today. Some Miocene hyenas were built more like wolves, with long legs and slender bodies adapted for pursuit hunting rather than scavenging. The cats were also diversifying rapidly in Africa. Early lions were beginning to develop the social hunting strategies that would make them such successful predators. But they had to compete with other large cats that no longer exist, including massive species of saber-toothed cats that specialized in hunting the abundant large herbivores of the African savannas. As the Miocene progressed, around 15 million years ago, the planet entered a period of even more dramatic cooling. This middle Miocene cooling event was driven by the continued expansion of Antarctic ice sheets and changes in ocean circulation patterns. The effects were felt around the world, but they were particularly dramatic in the northern hemisphere. The cooling temperatures were creating new opportunities for evolutionary innovation. In North America, the grasslands were becoming even more extensive, supporting herds of herbivores that numbered in the millions. The famous fossil sites of Nebraska and South Dakota preserve evidence of these massive aggregations, with bone beds containing thousands of individuals from multiple species. These weren't just random accumulations of fossils. They represent actual catastrophic events where entire herds were killed by drought, volcanic ash, or other natural disasters. The preservation is so good that scientists can study the herd structure, age distributions, and even the seasonal timing of these ancient tragedies. One of the most remarkable discoveries from these sites is evidence of the first truly massive predator packs. Bone beds contain the remains of dozens of amphibian individuals, suggesting that these bear dogs were hunting in coordinated groups much larger than any modern carnivore pack. The logistics of coordinating such large hunting groups would have required sophisticated communication and social organization. The Middle Miocene cooling was also driving evolutionary innovations in plant communities. The grasses that had appeared during the Oligocene were continuing to diversify, with new species adapted to increasingly cold and dry conditions. Some grass species were developing the ability to go dormant during winter, a crucial adaptation that would become even more important as the planet continued to cool. These changes in plant communities had cascading effects throughout terrestrial ecosystems. Herbivores had to develop new digestive strategies to process the increasingly fibrous and nutrient-poor vegetation. This drove the evolution of more complex digestive systems and more efficient chewing mechanisms. The horses were at the forefront of these dental innovations. Miocene horses like Merychippus were developing the high-crowned teeth that would become characteristic of all later horse evolution. These teeth could withstand the abrasive effects of silica-rich grasses, allowing horses to exploit food resources that other herbivores couldn't access. But the most dramatic evolutionary response to the cooling climate was happening in the northern regions, where entirely new ecosystems were beginning to form. The boreal forests that characterize northern Canada and Siberia today were first appearing during the Middle Miocene, creating habitats that had never existed before in Earth's history. These northern forests supported their own unique communities of mammals. Early members of the deer family were adapting to life in dense woodlands, developing the branched antlers that would become such a characteristic feature of this group. The first true bears were appearing, evolving from dog-like ancestors and developing the omnivorous diet that would make them such successful generalists. The cooling climate was also creating the first permanent ice sheets in Greenland, marking another milestone in the planet's journey toward the ice ages that would dominate the later Cenozoic. These ice sheets were having profound effects on global weather patterns, creating more extreme seasonal variations and driving the evolution of migration behaviors in numerous animal groups. The late Miocene, around 10 million years ago, saw the culmination of many of the evolutionary trends that had been building throughout the epoch. The grasslands had reached their maximum extent, supporting the most diverse communities of large mammals in Earth's history. The predator-prey relationships had evolved to levels of complexity that would never be matched again. But this golden age of mammalian diversity was also setting the stage for dramatic changes to come. The continued cooling of the planet was beginning to favor different types of organisms and different survival strategies. The massive herbivores that had dominated Miocene grasslands were about to face new challenges that would test their evolutionary adaptations to the limit. The stage was being set for the next great chapter in the story of life after the dinosaurs. The Pliocene epoch would bring even more dramatic cooling, the formation of the Panama land bridge, and evolutionary innovations that would ultimately lead to the ice ages and the emergence of our own species. But before we move on to those later developments, it's worth pausing to appreciate the sheer magnificence of Miocene life. This was an epoch when evolution seemed to be experimenting with every possible form and lifestyle. From the massive Paraceratherium browsing in Asian forests to the giant sharks patrolling Miocene oceans, from the saber-toothed cats of North America to the early apes of Africa, the Miocene represents perhaps the most creative period in the history of mammalian evolution. The creatures that lived during this remarkable epoch pushed the boundaries of what was possible for warm-blooded animals. They grew to sizes that challenged the laws of physics, developed hunting strategies of unprecedented sophistication, and created ecosystems of breathtaking complexity and beauty. As we prepare to explore what happened next in this epic story, remember that the Miocene world was built on the foundation laid by those small mammals that survived the dinosaur extinction 66 million years ago. In just 40 million years, their descendants had transformed the planet into something unrecognizable, creating a world of giants, predators, and evolutionary innovations that would influence the course of life for millions of years to come. The mammals had not just inherited the Earth from the dinosaurs, they had completely reimagined what life on our planet could be, and their story was far from over. As the Miocene drew to a close around 5 million years ago, our planet stood on the precipice of changes so profound they would reshape not just the continents, but the very essence of what it meant to be alive on Earth. The warm, stable world that had nurtured giants for over 15 million years was about to give way to something unprecedented in the planet's history, a time of ice and fire, of dramatic upheavals that would test every evolutionary adaptation that had emerged since the dinosaurs disappeared. The first harbinger of this transformation wasn't immediately obvious. In fact, if you had been standing in Central America during the late Miocene, you might have witnessed what appeared to be a relatively minor geological event. Volcanic islands were slowly rising from the ocean, connecting North and South America for the first time in over 60 million years. This narrow strip of land, what we now call the Isthmus of Panama, seemed insignificant compared to the vast continents on either side. But this small land bridge was about to trigger what scientists call the Great American Biotic interchange, one of the most dramatic mixing of faunas in Earth's history. And the consequences would be absolutely staggering. For over 60 million years, South America had been an isolated island continent, a natural laboratory where evolution had been conducting its own unique experiments. The creatures that had evolved there were unlike anything found anywhere else on Earth. Giant ground sloths the size of small elephants wandered through forests and grasslands. Glyptodonts, those armored mammals I mentioned earlier, had grown to the size of small cars. their shells decorated with spikes and knobs that would make a medieval knight jealous. But the most impressive South American mammals were the terrorbirds, which had reached their absolute evolutionary peak. Titanis wallari stood nearly 10 feet tall, with a skull over 2 feet long and a beak that could deliver crushing blows capable of shattering the bones of large mammals. These weren't just big birds. They were the apex predators of an entire continent, the undisputed rulers of South American ecosystems. The carnivorous mammals of South America were equally bizarre. Thylacosmilus was a marsupial that had independently evolved saber teeth remarkably similar to those of the placental saber-toothed cats in North America. This was convergent evolution at its most dramatic, showing how similar environmental pressures could produce nearly identical solutions in completely unrelated lineages. Meanwhile, North America had developed its own caste of evolutionary superstars. The horses had continued their remarkable transformation, with some species developing the single-toed anatomy that characterizes modern horses. The carnivores had reached new levels of diversity and sophistication, and perhaps most importantly, the first members of the human lineage were beginning their epic journey toward consciousness in Africa. When the Panama land bridge finally connected these two continents around 3 million years ago, it was like opening the floodgates between two different worlds. The mixing that followed was unlike anything that had happened since the breakup of the supercontinent Pangaea hundreds of millions of years earlier. The results were both magnificent and tragic. Northern mammals poured south like an evolutionary tsunami. Cats, dogs, bears, horses, deer, and elephants invaded South America, encountering creatures that had never seen their like before. The competition was fierce, and the South American natives, isolated for so long, were often outcompeted by these northern invaders. The terrorbirds, those magnificent predators that had ruled South America for tens of millions of years, suddenly found themselves facing competition from highly evolved placental carnivores like cats and dogs. The giant ground sloths, which had browsed peacefully in South American forests, were now sharing their habitats with northern herbivores that had been shaped by millions of years of predation pressure from sophisticated carnivores. But the interchange wasn't entirely one-sided. Some South American mammals made the journey north and established themselves successfully. Ground sloths spread throughout North America, with some species reaching the Arctic. Glyptodonts expanded their range into the southern United States. And perhaps most remarkably, some terrorbird species actually made it to North America, bringing their unique brand of avian predation to northern ecosystems. The mixing of these faunas created ecosystems of unprecedented diversity and complexity. In some regions, you could find African-derived elephants grazing alongside South American ground sloths, while North American cats hunted both continents' herbivores. It was like nature had decided to conduct the ultimate experiment in biogeography. But while this biological drama was playing out on land, even more profound changes were happening to the planet's climate system. The formation of the Panama land bridge didn't just connect two continents. It also fundamentally altered global ocean circulation patterns in ways that would have cascading effects on climate around the world. Before the land bridge formed, ocean currents could flow freely between the Atlantic and Pacific in the tropical regions. This circulation pattern helped distribute heat around the globe, maintaining the relatively warm, stable climate that had characterized much of the Miocene. But when Panama rose from the sea, it blocked this crucial circulation, forcing ocean currents to find new pathways. The result was the strengthening of the Gulf Stream, which carried warm water northward along the eastern coast of North America before crossing to Europe. This might sound like it would warm the northern hemisphere, and initially it did. But the increased evaporation from this warm current also increased precipitation, particularly snowfall in the northern regions. More snow meant more of the sun's energy was reflected back to space instead of being absorbed by dark ground. This cooling effect was amplified by a feedback loop. Cooler temperatures led to more snow, which led to even more cooling. The planet was entering what scientists call a positive feedback cycle toward Ice Age conditions. At the same time, other geological processes were contributing to the cooling trend. The continued uplift of mountain ranges like the Himalayas and the Rocky Mountains was exposing fresh rock to chemical weathering, a process that pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The expanding grasslands were also continuing to sequester carbon in their extensive root systems. All of these factors combined to drive atmospheric CO2 levels to their lowest point in hundreds of millions of years. By the end of the Pliocene epoch, around 2.6 million years ago, carbon dioxide concentrations had dropped to levels similar to those during ice ages, setting the stage for the dramatic climate oscillations that would characterize the Pleistocene. But before we reach the ice ages, we need to explore what was happening to the mammals themselves during this time of transition. The cooling climate and changing geography were creating new evolutionary pressures that would shape the final phase of post-dinosaur mammalian evolution. The large herbivores that had dominated Miocene grasslands were facing unprecedented challenges. The cooling climate was making vegetation more seasonal and less nutritious. The mixing of continental faunas was creating new competitive pressures. And perhaps most importantly, a new type of predator was beginning to emerge, one that would eventually change the rules of the evolutionary game entirely. In Africa, the early members of our own lineage were continuing their remarkable transformation. The Australopithecines, those early human ancestors, were developing increasingly sophisticated tool use and social organization. They were still primarily vegetarian, but they were beginning to supplement their diet with meat obtained through scavenging and possibly hunting. This dietary expansion was driving remarkable changes in brain development. The Australopithecine brain was still only about 1/3 the size of a modern human brain, but it was already showing signs of the reorganization that would eventually lead to human intelligence. Areas associated with tool use and social cognition were expanding, while regions associated with purely instinctual behaviors were becoming relatively smaller. The cooling climate was actually accelerating human evolution by creating environmental instability that favored behavioral flexibility over specialized adaptations. Our ancestors were learning to adapt to changing conditions through culture and technology, rather than through biological evolution alone. This was a fundamentally new survival strategy, one that would eventually prove more powerful than any purely biological adaptation. Meanwhile, the other mammals were responding to the changing world in their own ways. The horses were continuing their evolution toward the single-toed grass-eating specialists we know today, but they were also beginning to show the first signs of the size reduction that would characterize many mammalian lineages as the climate continued to cool. The carnivores were facing their own challenges. The massive bear dogs that had been such successful predators during the Miocene were beginning to decline as their prey species changed and new competitors appeared. The cats and true dogs were becoming increasingly dominant, their more efficient hunting strategies giving them advantages in the changing ecosystems. One group that was thriving in the cooling world was the proboscideans. Elephants, mammoths, and mastodons were diversifying into forms adapted to increasingly cold and seasonal environments. The first true mammoths were appearing, with their characteristic curved tusks and woolly coats that would make them icons of the ice ages to come. These cold-adapted elephants were developing remarkable physiological and behavioral adaptations. Their blood contained anti-freeze proteins that prevented ice crystal formation. Their trunks were becoming more sensitive and dexterous, allowing them to manipulate tools and clear snow from food sources. Some species were even developing seasonal migration patterns that covered thousands of miles. The marine environment was also responding to the changing climate. The cooling oceans were becoming more productive in some regions, as increased temperature gradients drove more vigorous circulation patterns. This productivity boom supported larger populations of marine mammals, including the continued diversification of whales and seals. But the most dramatic marine changes were happening in the Arctic, where sea ice was beginning to form on a seasonal basis for the first time in millions of years. This new habitat created opportunities for entirely new types of marine mammals. Early seals were adapting to life on ice floes, developing the specialized physiology that would allow them to thrive in polar environments. The formation of seasonal sea ice also had profound effects on global climate regulation. Ice reflects much more sunlight than open water, creating another cooling feedback loop. The planet was becoming increasingly sensitive to small changes in solar radiation or atmospheric composition. As we move into the Pliocene proper, around 5 million years ago, these cooling trends were accelerating. The first permanent ice sheets were beginning to form in Greenland and parts of Antarctica. The global climate was becoming increasingly unstable, with rapid oscillations between warmer and cooler periods. This climatic instability was driving evolutionary changes at an unprecedented pace. Species that had remained relatively unchanged for millions of years were suddenly facing intense selective pressure. Some adapted quickly and survived. Others, particularly the large specialized forms that had been so successful during the stable Miocene, began to decline toward extinction. The mammals that survived this transition tended to be smaller, more behaviorally flexible, and better able to cope with seasonal extremes. This was the beginning of a trend toward what scientists call dwarfing in many mammalian lineages. The giants of the Miocene were giving way to more modest-sized descendants, better suited to a world of increasing climatic uncertainty. But size reduction wasn't the only evolutionary response to the cooling world. Many mammals were developing more sophisticated behavioral strategies for dealing with seasonal resource scarcity. Migration patterns became more complex and predictable. Food storage behaviors evolved in numerous lineages. Social cooperation became increasingly important for survival. These behavioral innovations were driving continued brain evolution across multiple mammalian groups. The ungulates were developing better spatial memory for navigating complex migration routes. The carnivores were evolving more sophisticated hunting strategies and pack coordination. Even small mammals like rodents were developing increasingly complex social systems. The plant communities were also undergoing dramatic changes during this period. The lush forests and extensive grasslands of the Miocene were giving way to more open, seasonal vegetation types. Tundra was appearing for the first time in millions of years. Coniferous forests were expanding at the expense of deciduous woodlands. These changes in plant communities had cascading effects throughout terrestrial ecosystems. Herbivores had to develop new feeding strategies to cope with more fibrous, less nutritious vegetation. Digestive systems became even more specialized, with some species developing the ability to extract nutrition from materials that would have been inedible to their Miocene ancestors. The cooling climate was also affecting reproduction and life history strategies. Many mammals were shifting from year-round breeding to seasonal reproduction, timed to coincide with periods of resource abundance. Gestation periods were becoming more synchronized with seasonal cycles. Parental care was becoming more intensive as offspring faced increasingly challenging environmental conditions. These reproductive changes were having profound effects on population dynamics and social organization. Seasonal breeding led to the evolution of more complex mating systems and social hierarchies. Competition for mates became more intense and ritualized. Sexual selection was driving the evolution of elaborate displays and weaponry in many species. The late Pliocene, around 3 million years ago, marked another crucial turning point in this epic story. The global climate system was approaching a critical threshold beyond which the relatively stable conditions of the past 50 million years would give way to the dramatic oscillations of the ice ages. But the mammals were ready. 50 million years of evolution since the dinosaur extinction had produced creatures of remarkable adaptability and resilience. They had survived the hothouse world of the Eocene, adapted to the grassland revolution of the Oligocene, thrived during the golden age of the Miocene, and were now preparing for the ultimate test of their evolutionary innovations. The stage was set for the final act in the story of post-dinosaur mammalian evolution. The ice ages would bring challenges that would dwarf anything these creatures had faced since the asteroid impact that started their remarkable journey. But they would also create opportunities for evolutionary breakthroughs that would ultimately lead to the emergence of human civilization and the transformation of the planet in ways that even the dinosaurs could never have imagined. As we stand on the threshold of this final chapter, it's worth reflecting on the incredible journey we've traced. From small, rat-like creatures hiding in burrows during the age of dinosaurs to the magnificent giants and sophisticated hunters of the late Pliocene, mammals had completely transformed the planet. They had experimented with every possible lifestyle, conquered every available habitat, and developed levels of intelligence and social complexity that would have been impossible during the Age of Reptiles. But their greatest adventures were still ahead of them. The ice ages would test every adaptation, every survival strategy, every evolutionary innovation that had emerged during the long journey from the post-extinction world. Some lineages would thrive in the new conditions, others would face extinction, and from this final crucible would emerge the creatures that would inherit the modern world, including one species that would eventually develop the ability to understand and tell the very story we've been exploring. The mammals were about to face their ultimate challenge. But they were no longer the small, hidden creatures that had survived the dinosaur extinction. They were the inheritors of 60 million years of evolutionary innovation, armed with adaptations and abilities that would allow them to not just survive the coming ice ages, but to transform them into opportunities for even greater evolutionary achievements. The greatest chapter in the story of life after the dinosaurs was about to begin. The ice ages that were about to begin would represent the ultimate test of everything evolution had achieved since the dinosaur extinction. But here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. The creatures entering this frozen world weren't just survivors anymore. They had become masters of adaptation, armed with 60 million years of evolutionary innovation that would allow them to turn the harshest conditions our planet had ever seen into opportunities for unprecedented breakthroughs. Picture the moment when the first massive ice sheets began their relentless march across the northern continents. This wasn't a gradual cooling like turning down a thermostat. This was nature hitting the reset button on an entire planet, transforming landscapes that had remained stable for millions of years into something completely alien and hostile. The Pleistocene epoch began 2.6 million years ago with what scientists call the Quaternary glaciation, and it would continue for the next 2.5 million years in cycles that defy imagination. Every 40,000 to 100,000 years, massive ice sheets would advance from the poles, sometimes covering a third of the planet's land surface. Then, just as dramatically, they would retreat, leaving behind landscapes carved and reshaped by the unimaginable power of moving ice. But here's what will absolutely blow your mind about this period. Instead of causing mass extinctions like you might expect, these ice ages actually supercharged mammalian evolution. The constant environmental pressure created a kind of evolutionary arms race where only the most adaptable, most intelligent, and most innovative creatures could survive. It was like the planet had decided to conduct the ultimate experiment in natural selection. Let me show you just how dramatic these changes were. During the glacial maxima, ice sheets over a mile thick covered most of Canada, northern Europe, and parts of Asia. So much water was locked up in ice that global sea levels dropped by over 400 feet. Land bridges appeared between continents that had been separated for millions of years. The Bering Land Bridge connected Asia and North America. Britain was attached to continental Europe. Australia and New Guinea formed a single landmass. These connections allowed for migrations on a scale that dwarfed even the Great American Biotic interchange. Mammals that had evolved in isolation suddenly found themselves mixing with creatures from completely different continents. Asian elephants walked into North America. American horses migrated to Asia. European cave bears wandered into new territories. It was like nature had opened highways between worlds that had been separated for geological ages. The mammals that thrived during these ice ages developed adaptations so remarkable they seem almost supernatural. Take the woolly mammoth, perhaps the most iconic Ice Age creature. These weren't just hairy elephants. They were living, breathing monuments to evolutionary engineering. A woolly mammoth's coat consisted of 3 distinct layers: a dense undercoat of fine wool, a middle layer of coarser guard hairs, and an outer layer of long flowing hair that could reach 3 feet in length. This created an insulation system so effective that mammoths could maintain their body temperature in conditions that would kill a modern elephant within hours. But the adaptations went far beyond just staying warm. Mammoth blood contained specialized proteins that functioned like biological antifreeze, preventing ice crystals from forming in their circulatory system. Their ears were tiny compared to modern elephants, reducing heat loss. Their tails were short and stubby for the same reason. Even their trunks were more muscular and sensitive, allowing them to manipulate tools and clear snow with remarkable precision. These giants weren't just surviving in the Ice Age world, they were thriving. Herds of woolly mammoths numbered in the hundreds of thousands, creating migrations that stretched across entire continents. Their trampling and feeding behavior actually helped maintain the grassland ecosystems that supported dozens of other large mammal species. But mammoths weren't the only giants adapting to the frozen world. Woolly rhinoceroses developed their own suite of cold weather adaptations, including a massive horn that some scientists believe was used like a snowplow to clear feeding areas. Cave bears grew to enormous sizes, some weighing over 1,500 pounds, and developed the ability to hibernate for months at a time in the extensive cave systems that provided shelter from the bitter cold. The predators of the Ice Age world were equally impressive. The cave lion was 25% larger than modern lions, with a build adapted for hunting the massive herbivores that dominated Ice Age ecosystems. But perhaps the most remarkable predator was one that most people don't immediately think of as an Ice Age animal, the saber-toothed cat, Smilodon. Now, Smilodon actually lived in the warmer regions of North and South America, but it represents the culmination of saber-tooth evolution that had been ongoing since the Miocene. These weren't just cats with big teeth. They were precision killing machines, perfectly adapted for hunting the thick-skinned megafauna of their time. A Smilodon's canine teeth could reach 7 inches in length, but they weren't just oversized fangs. They were carefully engineered weapons with serrated edges like steak knives. The skull was massively reinforced to handle the stresses of delivering killing bites. The jaw muscles were arranged to provide maximum force at the precise angle needed for their hunting technique. But here's what makes Smilodon truly remarkable. These cats were probably pack hunters. Fossil evidence from the La Brea tar pits shows that injured Smilodon individuals survived for extended periods with healed fractures, suggesting they were cared for by other members of their group. This level of social cooperation in a large predator was unprecedented and shows just how sophisticated Ice Age mammal behavior had become. The smaller mammals were developing their own incredible adaptations. Arctic foxes evolved the ability to change their coat color seasonally, from brown in summer to pure white in winter. Their paws developed fur-covered pads that worked like natural snowshoes. Their ears became rounded and small to reduce heat loss, while their tails became so fluffy they could wrap them around their bodies like living blankets. Some mammals took adaptation to truly extraordinary extremes. The musk ox developed an outer coat of guard hairs called civiate that's warmer than sheep's wool and finer than cashmere. Beneath this was a dense undercoat that trapped warm air so effectively that musk oxen could survive temperatures of -40 degrees Fahrenheit with no shelter whatsoever. But perhaps the most remarkable adaptation was happening in the most unexpected place: the human brain. Our ancestors were facing the same Ice Age pressures as every other mammal, but they were developing a fundamentally different survival strategy. Instead of growing thicker fur or larger bodies, they were growing bigger brains and more sophisticated cultures. The early humans of the Ice Ages weren't just surviving, they were innovating at a pace that had never been seen before in evolutionary history. They learned to control fire, not just for warmth but for cooking food, which made more calories available and supported even larger brains. They developed sophisticated tool technologies, creating spear points, scrapers, and cutting implements that were more effective than the natural weapons of most predators. They learned to hunt cooperatively, taking down mammoths, woolly rhinos, and other megafauna that no individual human could possibly kill alone. They developed clothing technologies using animal skins and furs that allowed them to survive in environments where their naked bodies would freeze within minutes. They created shelters, art, and complex social systems that could preserve knowledge across generations. This cultural evolution was happening at lightning speed compared to biological evolution. A new tool technology could spread across continents in centuries rather than the millions of years required for biological adaptations. Humans were essentially developing a new kind of evolution, one based on information and learning rather than genes and natural selection. But they weren't the only mammals developing remarkable cognitive abilities during the Ice Ages. Many other species were evolving larger brains and more sophisticated behaviors in response to the challenging and constantly changing environments. Wolves were developing increasingly complex pack coordination strategies. Their hunting techniques became so sophisticated that they could bring down prey many times their size through precise teamwork. They learned to communicate over long distances using howls that conveyed specific information about prey location and pack movements. Cave bears weren't just big and strong, they were developing remarkable spatial memory abilities that allowed them to navigate complex cave systems in total darkness. Some caves contain bear scratches and wallows that show these animals were using specific areas for different purposes, suggesting a level of environmental organization that approaches human-like planning. Even smaller mammals were showing unprecedented cognitive development. Beavers were creating engineering projects that rivaled human constructions in their complexity. Their dams could span hundreds of yards and create wetland ecosystems that supported dozens of other species. The planning and coordination required for these projects suggests cognitive abilities far beyond simple instinctual behavior. The Ice Ages were also driving the evolution of remarkable migration behaviors. As ice sheets advanced and retreated, animals had to constantly adjust their ranges and movement patterns. This created selection pressure for better navigation abilities, more accurate timing mechanisms, and more sophisticated social coordination during mass movements. Reindeer developed migration patterns that covered thousands of miles and involved hundreds of thousands of individuals moving in coordinated waves across the Arctic landscape. Their ability to navigate using celestial cues, magnetic fields, and landscape features was so precise that they could return to specific calving grounds year after year, despite the constantly changing Ice Age environment. Birds were developing their own remarkable adaptations. Snowy owls evolved the ability to hunt in complete darkness, using hearing so acute they could locate prey moving beneath several feet of snow. Ptarmigan developed feathered feet that worked like natural snowshoes, and the ability to change their plumage seasonally for perfect camouflage. The marine environment was equally transformed during the Ice Ages. The formation of massive ice sheets altered ocean circulation patterns and created new habitats for marine mammals. Seals and walruses evolved sophisticated diving abilities that allowed them to hunt beneath thick ice sheets. Some species could hold their breath for over an hour and dive to depths of more than 1,000 feet. Whales were adapting to the changing ocean conditions in their own remarkable ways. Some species developed the ability to break through ice several feet thick, using their heads like living battering rams. Others evolved more efficient heat conservation systems that allowed them to maintain body temperature in near freezing water. But perhaps the most dramatic Ice Age evolution was happening in the plant kingdom. The constant advance and retreat of ice sheets created a mosaic of disturbed habitats that favored plants with rapid reproduction and dispersal abilities. Grasses evolved even more efficient photosynthesis systems and more extensive root networks that could quickly colonize newly exposed ground as glaciers retreated. Trees developed new strategies for surviving in the harsh Ice Age climates. Conifers evolved more efficient needle shapes and waxy coatings that reduced water loss in the dry, cold air. Deciduous trees developed more precise timing mechanisms for leaf drop and bud break, allowing them to make the most of short growing seasons. The interaction between plants and animals reached new levels of complexity during the Ice Ages. Large herbivores like mammoths and ground sloths became ecosystem engineers, their feeding and trampling behavior maintaining the grassland habitats that supported dozens of other species. When these megafauna eventually went extinct, some plant communities collapsed entirely, showing just how interconnected Ice Age ecosystems had become. The Ice Ages also saw the development of some of the most remarkable symbiotic relationships in mammalian history. Humans and wolves began their long partnership during this period, with early dogs providing hunting assistance and protection in exchange for food and shelter. This relationship was so successful that it spread around the world and eventually gave rise to the incredible diversity of domestic dog breeds we see today. Other mammals were developing their own cooperative relationships. Some evidence suggests that early humans may have had partnerships with other species beyond dogs. Cave paintings show humans apparently cooperating with cave lions and other predators, though the exact nature of these relationships remains mysterious. The social complexity of Ice Age mammals reached unprecedented levels. Mammoth herds developed sophisticated hierarchical structures with experienced matriarchs, leading groups that could include hundreds of individuals. These leaders possessed detailed knowledge of migration routes, water sources, and feeding areas that was passed down through generations. Cave hyenas lived in clans that could include dozens of individuals with complex territorial behaviors and cooperative hunting strategies. Their dens became centers of social activity where young were raised collectively and knowledge about hunting techniques was shared among clan members. Even herbivores developed remarkable social innovations. Giant ground sloths may have lived in small family groups that cooperated in defense against predators. Their massive claws weren't just for digging and feeding. They were formidable weapons that could inflict devastating wounds on even the largest predators. The Ice Ages created environments so challenging that they drove the evolution of behavioral flexibility and learning ability across virtually every mammalian lineage. Animals that could modify their behavior based on experience had enormous advantages over those locked into rigid, instinctual patterns. This pressure for behavioral flexibility was creating the foundation for what would eventually become human civilization. The ability to learn, plan, and cooperate that evolved during the Ice Ages would eventually allow our species to transform the planet in ways that no previous life form had ever achieved. But the Ice Ages weren't just about survival and adaptation, they were also about extinction. The same environmental pressures that drove remarkable evolutionary innovations also eliminated many of the magnificent creatures that had dominated earlier epochs. The giant ground sloths that had thrived for millions of years couldn't adapt quickly enough to the rapidly changing Ice Age environments. The massive bear dogs that had been such successful predators during the Miocene were outcompeted by more efficient carnivores. Many of the specialized browsers and grazers of earlier epochs simply couldn't cope with the constantly shifting vegetation patterns. These extinctions weren't random. They followed clear patterns that reveal the kinds of adaptations that were successful during the Ice Ages. Large, specialized species with slow reproduction rates were particularly vulnerable. Small, behaviorally flexible species with rapid reproduction were more likely to survive. But the most dramatic extinctions were still to come. As the Ice Ages drew to a close around 12,000 years ago, the world would witness the most rapid wave of large mammal extinctions since the dinosaur impact. And this time, the cause wouldn't be an asteroid or volcanic eruption. It would be the remarkable success of one particular Ice Age mammal that had learned to reshape entire ecosystems through intelligence and cooperation. The stage was set for the final transformation of the post-dinosaur world. The mammals that had survived the Ice Ages were about to face their ultimate challenge: coexistence with a species that had developed the ability to alter the planet's climate, reshape its landscapes, and drive other species to extinction not through natural selection, but through conscious choice. The age of humans was about to begin, and with it would come changes to the Earth that would dwarf even the dramatic transformations we've witnessed since the dinosaur extinction. The remarkable journey from small hidden mammals to Ice Age giants was reaching its conclusion, but the story of life on Earth was entering its most dramatic and unpredictable chapter yet. The mammals had inherited a world from the dinosaurs and transformed it beyond recognition. Now they were about to hand it over to a species that would take that transformation to levels that even 66 million years of evolution could never have predicted. The greatest adventure in the history of life on Earth was just beginning. The transition from Ice Age to the modern world wasn't a gentle awakening. It was more like someone had suddenly switched on every heating system on the planet at once. Around 11,700 years ago, the last major ice age came to an abrupt end, and the world that emerged from beneath those retreating glaciers was about to witness the most dramatic ecological transformation since the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. But here's what makes this moment absolutely extraordinary. For the first time in Earth's history, one species was about to reshape entire ecosystems, not through millions of years of gradual evolution, but through conscious decision-making and technological innovation. The humans who had survived the ice ages weren't just another mammalian success story anymore. They had become something entirely new in the history of life. Picture the scene as those massive ice sheets began their final retreat. Landscapes that had been frozen for tens of thousands of years were suddenly exposed to sunlight for the first time. Rivers began flowing in channels that had been locked in ice. Lakes formed and disappeared within decades. And across these rapidly changing environments, the surviving mammals were facing opportunities and challenges unlike anything their ancestors had ever encountered. The megafauna that had defined the Ice Age world were about to face their ultimate test. These weren't gradual environmental changes that could be adapted to over thousands of generations. These were transformations happening within single lifespans, requiring behavioral flexibility that many of these magnificent creatures simply couldn't develop fast enough. The woolly mammoths that had dominated the northern grasslands found their habitat literally melting away beneath their feet. The vast, cold steppes where they had thrived for hundreds of thousands of years were being replaced by forests and wetlands that couldn't support such massive herbivores. Their specialized adaptations for extreme cold, which had been such advantages during the ice ages, were becoming liabilities in the warming world. But the environmental changes were only part of the challenge these giants were facing. Those early humans who had learned to hunt cooperatively during the ice ages weren't just surviving the warming world, they were exploding in population and spreading across every available habitat with unprecedented speed. These weren't the small bands of early humans that had barely survived the harsh ice age conditions. These were sophisticated hunter-gatherer societies with advanced technologies, complex social organization, and most importantly, the ability to modify their environment rather than simply adapting to it. Within just a few thousand years, humans had developed agriculture, fundamentally altering their relationship with the natural world. Instead of following herds and gathering wild plants, they were creating artificial ecosystems designed to maximize food production. They were clearing forests, draining wetlands, and converting natural habitats into farms and settlements. The impact on the surviving megafauna was catastrophic. Ground sloths that had wandered South American forests for millions of years found their habitats fragmented and their food sources depleted. Giant beavers that had engineered wetland ecosystems for thousands of years were outcompeted by human landscape modifications. Cave bears that had survived multiple ice age cycles couldn't adapt to the rapid human expansion into their mountain territories. The extinctions that followed were unlike anything in the fossil record. This wasn't a gradual winnowing of species over millions of years. Within just 10,000 years of the Ice Age's end, roughly 80% of all large mammal species had disappeared forever. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, cave bears, giant beavers, and dozens of other magnificent creatures vanished from the earth. But while the megafauna were disappearing, other mammals were seizing the opportunities created by human activities. The landscapes that humans were creating, with their mixture of cleared areas and forest edges, were perfect for many smaller, more adaptable species. Rodents found that human settlements provided abundant food sources and shelter opportunities. Early farms attracted seed-eating species that learned to exploit agricultural crops. The clearings that humans created for farming became highways for species that preferred open habitats over dense forests. Some mammals went even further, entering into partnerships with humans that would fundamentally alter both species. The wolves that had learned to hunt cooperatively during the Ice Ages found that following human hunting parties provided access to food sources they couldn't obtain alone. Over generations, this relationship deepened into something unprecedented: domestication. The transformation of wolves into dogs represents one of the most remarkable evolutionary experiments in Earth's history. Through selective breeding, humans created creatures that were no longer truly wild animals, but weren't quite human artifacts either. Dogs became living bridges between the natural and artificial worlds, retaining their mammalian heritage while adapting to human-designed environments. But dogs were just the beginning. As human societies became more complex and settled, they began domesticating other mammals for specific purposes. Cattle provided meat, milk, and labor. Horses revolutionized transportation and warfare. Sheep and goats supplied wool and dairy products. Pigs converted waste into protein. Each domestication event represented a fundamental alteration in the evolutionary trajectory of a mammalian species. These animals were no longer subject primarily to natural selection. Instead, they were being shaped by human preferences and needs, developing traits that would never have evolved in wild populations. The impact extended far beyond the domesticated species themselves. The landscapes required to support agricultural societies were completely different from the ecosystems that had dominated the post-Ice Age world. Forests were cleared for farmland. Wetlands were drained for agriculture. Grasslands were converted to pastures for livestock. These human-modified environments created entirely new ecological niches that some mammals were quick to exploit. Rats and mice found that human settlements provided year-round food sources and protection from predators. They spread across the globe along human trade routes, becoming among the most successful mammals in the post-Ice Age world. Other species adapted to the edges of human civilization. Foxes learned to scavenge in human settlements while maintaining their wild behavior patterns. Deer discovered that the forest edges created by human activities provided optimal feeding opportunities. Bears found that human food sources could supplement their natural diets, leading to complex relationships that persist today. The speed of these changes was absolutely unprecedented in the history of life. Ecosystems that had been stable for thousands of years were transformed within centuries. Species relationships that had evolved over millions of years were disrupted and replaced by entirely new interactions. But perhaps the most remarkable development was happening within human societies themselves. The agricultural revolution wasn't just changing how humans obtained food. It was transforming human biology and behavior in ways that would have been impossible during their hunter-gatherer phase. Settled agricultural life allowed for population densities that were impossible for nomadic societies. These larger populations supported increased specialization, with individuals focusing on specific skills like toolmaking, pottery, or animal husbandry. This specialization accelerated technological development exponentially. The surplus food production made possible by agriculture freed some individuals from subsistence activities entirely, allowing them to become full-time innovators, leaders, or knowledge keepers. This created positive feedback loops where technological and social innovations reinforced each other, driving human societies toward increasing complexity. The development of permanent settlements also fundamentally altered human relationships with other species. Instead of being just another predator in natural ecosystems, humans were creating artificial environments where they controlled most variables. They decided which species could live in their territories and which would be excluded or eliminated. This power to consciously shape species composition was something entirely new in Earth's history. Previous mass extinction events had been caused by external forces like asteroid impacts or volcanic eruptions. The end Pleistocene extinctions were the first time that one species was consciously driving others to extinction through deliberate actions. But human impact wasn't limited to direct hunting and habitat destruction. The introduction of domesticated animals into new environments was having cascading effects throughout ecosystems. Cattle, sheep, and goats were altering vegetation patterns through their grazing behavior. Pigs were disrupting soil systems and affecting plant regeneration. Horses were compacting soils and changing grass species composition. These introduced species were also bringing new diseases and parasites that native wildlife had no resistance to. The ecological disruptions caused by these biological invasions were often more devastating than direct human hunting or habitat modification. The mammals that survived this transformation were those that could either partner with humans or exploit the opportunities created by human activities. The species that thrived were typically small, behaviorally flexible, and capable of rapid reproduction. The large specialized species that had been the stars of earlier epochs were increasingly confined to remote areas where human impact was minimal. As human societies continued to grow and develop new technologies, their impact on mammalian communities accelerated. The invention of metallurgy allowed for more efficient hunting tools and agricultural implements. The development of writing systems enabled the accumulation and transmission of knowledge about animal behavior and management techniques. Trade networks began connecting human societies across vast distances, facilitating the spread of domesticated species and agricultural techniques. These networks also inadvertently spread diseases and invasive species, creating biological homogenization on a scale never before seen in Earth's history. The rise of urban centers represented another fundamental shift in human-mammal relationships. Cities created entirely artificial environments where only the most adaptable species could survive. Rats, mice, cats, and dogs became the dominant mammals in these human-created ecosystems, while most wild species were completely excluded. Yet even as human activities were driving many mammalian species toward extinction, they were also creating new opportunities for evolutionary innovation. The artificial selection practiced by humans was accelerating evolutionary change in domesticated species far beyond natural rates. Dog breeds diversified into forms that spanned a greater range of sizes and shapes than existed in their wild wolf ancestors. Cattle developed specialized breeds for different purposes, from dairy production to draft work. Horses evolved into forms optimized for specific human needs, from heavy draft animals to swift riding horses. These human-directed evolutionary experiments' plasticity of mammalian genetics were revealing the incredible. Traits that would take millions of years to evolve, naturally, could be selected for and fixed within dozens of generations through careful breeding programs. The knowledge gained from these breeding experiments was also advancing human understanding of heredity and biological relationships. Farmers and herders were developing sophisticated understanding of genetics centuries before the formal discovery of DNA, using this knowledge to improve their animals and crops continuously. As we approach the modern era, the relationship between humans and other mammals had become the dominant force shaping mammalian evolution and distribution. the natural processes that had driven mammalian diversification for 66 million years were increasingly being replaced by conscious human decisions about which species would survive and which would be allowed to go extinct. And so we reach the end of one of the most extraordinary stories ever told. From the moment that asteroid struck Earth 66 million years ago, erasing the dinosaurs in an instant, we've witnessed the most incredible comeback in the history of life itself. Those tiny, rat-sized mammals hiding in burrows didn't just survive the apocalypse. They inherited an entire planet and transformed it beyond recognition, evolving into giants that dwarfed their reptilian predecessors, developing intelligence that could reshape ecosystems, and ultimately giving rise to a species capable of understanding its own cosmic origins. The mammals didn't just fill the empty world the dinosaurs left behind. They reimagined what life on Earth could be, proving that sometimes the greatest opportunities emerge from the most devastating disasters. Next time you see a squirrel in your backyard or watch a whale breach the ocean's surface, remember that you're looking at the descendants of the ultimate underdogs, creatures whose ancestors survived the end of the world and built something even more magnificent in its place. I wish you a very good night. I hope you had an amazing time with me here at Boring Science. I will see you tomorrow, as always. Until then, stay curious, keep wondering. This is Boring Science signing off. Cheers.